So hey everyone, my name is Hamza and welcome to Threat Hunting 101, where we'll be talking about how you can become a threat hunter or at least get started with some threat hunting of your own. Because there's a lot more people capable of being threat hunters in the industry right now than you might think. And a question I'd like you to keep in mind throughout the talk is, could I be a threat hunter according to what this guy is saying? Because what inspired me to do this talk is that a lot of people have skills and experiences within their current jobs which are very much relevant to threat hunting. And at the end of the day, being a threat hunter at its core is all about the mindset that you have, which is a matter of having a perspective when hunting through data, which is more broad and proactive than the traditional methods that we know, which is what makes all the difference. So my name is Hamza, and I'm a threat hunter for CommSec, which is MWR's managed threat hunting service. So my days consist of dealing with all kinds of attacks being directed at our clients, as well as coming up with new ways of detecting new attacks and techniques. And in terms of qualifications, I'm trained both offensively and defensively with OSCP and CRIA, in addition to my degree. And I'd like you to keep this mix of offensive and defensive knowledge in mind because it's going to be a recurring theme throughout the talk. But more importantly, I've had the opportunity to learn from some of the best people in the industry, and the people I work with at CommSec and MWR as a whole are some of the best at what they do, with some of them being the very founders of threat hunting. So to give you a quick recap of how threat hunting got to where it's at today, so 2016 was really the year which saw the rise of threat hunting, at least in terms of popularity. And it proved itself as a successor to what we know as traditional security operations centers. And it created a new breed of security professionals known as threat hunters. And before that, you could say that threat hunting still existed, or that threat hunters still existed, but they were mainly individuals who had a certain set of skills and experiences which they gathered through their own unique journeys. And people at MWR have been threat hunting long before its rise in popularity. In 2016, it was actually a part of the methodology that they used to carry out compromise assessments. And consultants would actually find themselves hunting for signs of compromise in a way which wasn't really being done elsewhere in the defensive industry. And so when those people started to get together and talk about the value of those particular skills and experiences in terms of improving our industry's defensive capability, then threat hunting was born. And that brings us to 2017, where the goal is to define what makes up a threat hunter and how they're set to develop in the future. So my goal today is to bridge the gap between you and threat hunting and to show you how you can be a threat hunter in your current position by getting started with the skills and knowledge which you already have. And I'll be doing that in 3 stages over the next 20 minutes or so. So first, I'll briefly go through what threat hunting is and why it exists. Second, I'll go through where threat hunters fit into the overall threat hunting process and the skills that are involved. And third, we'll go through some key stages of an attack scenario to see how those skills are applied at each stage of the kill chain and to demonstrate how threat hunting works in action. So what is threat hunting? Our friends at Squirrel have a pretty clear and concise definition for threat hunting. And you'll often find that the term threat hunting is used as a buzzword in the industry right now, now that it's become popular. But Squirrel are one of the few who are very much driving things in the right direction and starting with this definition. So the key takeaways from it are that threat hunting is all about being proactive. So not necessarily relying on a product to give you alerts about malicious activity. Instead, threat hunting as a human-driven approach to searching through data and to hunt for things which evade existing security solutions, which have been found to be mostly automated and alert-driven. So that might raise the question, is there something wrong with automated products and tools? And one of our threat hunters summarized it best in a blog post he wrote when he said that with traditional detection, which is mainly based on automated products, you start with technology, and then you use people to get the most out of that technology. But with threat hunting, you actually start with people, and then you use technology to get the most out of those people, which is a completely different way of, or the total opposite way of going about it. And this is true when you think about how traditional SOC analysts act on alerts from a product, which makes the product itself the limiting factor in that scenario. But threat hunting flips that model on its head, and in fact, a big part of being a threat hunter is to have a hand in developing and customizing the tools that you use to gather and visualize data which you've decided is relevant for an attack. Because nowadays you need a defensive solution which not only handles black and white situations, but also the gray areas where attacker activity can actually look a lot like legitimate activity, and it's very hard to discern. So to put threat hunting in context for you, I wanted to talk about automated versus manual techniques from an offensive and defensive point of view. So automated techniques, as we know, they scale better, they're very efficient, but what you gain in quantity, you start to lose in quality. And on the other hand, manual techniques will often give you better quality results. It just takes longer to get them. And pen testers in the crowd will be familiar with this, so you can run fully automated tools like Nessus, for example, on scale and get results very quickly about common vulnerabilities, but that won't give you anywhere near the same results that a targeted red team attack would or a pen test would. You then have the semi-automated techniques using tools like Nmap or attack frameworks, where you're looking to gather specific information and then use modules which automate the manual techniques for you. So looking at it from the defensive side, defensive products like next-gen AVs or SIMs would be the equivalent to Nessus, and it's there to tell you about known signature threats that are already known about. You then have the semi-automated level, where you have things like endpoint detection and response tools, or even just custom scripts which you've written yourself, which are there to collect the data that you need, and then pass that data through modules which are based on the manual hunting techniques that you use to automate them and then visualize the specific patterns and techniques that you're looking out for in terms of the attacks that you're interested in. This then gives you the space to drive innovation in the defensive area and focus more on hunting things which you haven't actually seen before. So you can see how threat hunting is effectively designed to be the equivalent of pen testing, which is a far more targeted and higher quality approach to playing defense. And what that does is that it levels the playing field, because if there's one thing that attackers have adapted to, it's the automated nature of security products. And in that model, the disadvantage that you have is that the attacker gets as many goals as they want to get around those products. But the defending team only have one chance to catch the attackers. But with threat hunting, you're going in with the mindset that there is a way to catch the attacker at each stage of the kill chain, and you're actively collecting and looking through data which will allow you to achieve that. So let's talk about the skill areas which are needed or that you will acquire as a threat hunter. And this is loosely based on Crest's model. And so if you want an in-depth understanding of everything that these skill areas actually include, you can find their syllabus on their website. But starting with your offensive knowledge, the key here is that you're developing your attacker mindset while threat hunting. So you understand how an attacker can carry out attacks and use that knowledge while threat hunting. And like I mentioned before, many of the people that started threat hunting at CommSec were previously pen testers for many years. And the goal they had when switching to defense was, how can we catch ourselves? Because right now, no one else is. And so then you have the four different defensive areas, which have to do with host and network analysis, as well as malware and memory analysis. And we'll break those down with a few examples in just a moment. So here's a sample of the roles which currently exist in the industry, both on the offensive and defensive side. And something I want to point out is that all of these roles require skills and knowledge which very much overlap with threat hunting. And to me, that's untapped potential to have more people involved in threat hunting at some level, or at least be able to work alongside threat hunting teams which might be providing threat hunting as a service for them. So, for example, if you come from an offensive background, you already have the attacker mindset that you need. But you might be lacking the defensive skills and vice versa. So if you're a defensive person, you might not have done any pen testing before. So you need to get your knowledge up in that regard. So the starting point is going to be different for everyone, and that's absolutely fine. The thing to understand is that when it comes to threat hunting, one person just doing one set of skills or one thing is too much of an overhead. And so in its current form, the threat hunter role takes the skills that it needs from the offensive and defensive side and brings them all together into one role, which is what allows threat hunting to be as lean and efficient as it needs to be. Otherwise, it wouldn't really work. So now to break down those skill areas a little further and give you an idea of how a threat hunter might use those skills during an investigation. So things like malware make you use your malware and memory analysis skills, and the goal here is to be able to investigate unknown malware samples, which is essential in discovering new malware variants and techniques. And with malware reversing, if you go beyond static analysis and into dynamic analysis, you'll often find yourself doing some form of memory forensics. And those memory analysis skills are really critical when dealing with something like process injection, where files don't necessarily get dropped onto disk to be signatured in any way, and everything is actually running in memory. So you then have things like persistence mechanisms, which rely on your in-depth knowledge of host analysis. And those are essential because attackers are coming up with really obscure and creative ways of persisting on a machine. And finally, on the network side of things, your knowledge there will help you track the attacker's lateral movements inside a network, as well as uncover their external command and control infrastructure. So let's move on to the attack scenario here, which is mainly going to focus on a typical Windows environment. And before we do, in red here, we have the attack kill chain, which everyone is familiar with. Now, there's also the defensive equivalent, which was put together by Mark Swan, and it outlines the defensive process. Now, what threat hunting aims to do is to apply that defensive kill chain at each step of an attack in order to actually stop it in its tracks. So what you have is a window of opportunity where the goal is to execute the defensive kill chain faster than the attacker's one at each stage of their attack. So threat hunting covers the entire kill chain, but in the interest of time, I've decided to focus on 3 aspects of an attack, which I've always ended up looking into when threat hunting. And those areas are going to be the infection vector, which gives you coverage of how an attack might get started, the persistence mechanism, which gives you coverage of how an attacker is maintaining access to the environment, and finally, any evidence of lateral movement, especially if you have evidence that an attack has already taken place on your estate. And by focusing on these key areas, you'd be off to a good start in terms of threat hunting in the right places. So the place we're going to start from when looking at each of these areas is to come up with a hypothesis. So the hypothesis here represents the human-driven element of threat hunting that I mentioned. And so, for example, you could say that I think that technique X is being used by an attacker, and I'm going to look for evidence of this by answering the 3 key questions, which are: what data do I need? How do I actually get that data? And where do I get it from? And how do I hunt through that data to find evidence of what I'm looking for? And I also wanted to mention some open source and commercial tools that you likely need to actually get started, because I'm conscious that threat hunting as I know it is all about doing it at scale on thousands of endpoints with the benefit of an EDR tool and a security budget. But if you're a smaller organization or just someone who's interested in doing this, then you actually have a lot less data to go through, which makes open source tools effective enough if you know what you're doing. So overall, you're looking at tools which collect your host data, like GRR and Sysmon, your network data with something like Bro, which is an open source network analysis framework, and your log data with something like Winbeat, which is part of the Elastic Stack. And that's actually one of the things that I recommend, to then centralize all your data and to be able to query and visualize it. So with things like Kibana and Elastic, you'll be able to query the data that you collect and visualize it in all the ways that you need. And then you have a few other tools that help you maintain and deploy the tools that you're using or the scripts that you might be using, and that will help you scale things a little bit better within your environment instead of just doing things on a sort of one-to-one basis. So the first part of an attack of the attack scenario is going to be infection vectors, and these can come in various forms. And when I'm threat hunting, I'm first thinking about the delivery method, which can either be external, like phishing, for example, or it can be internal, like a compromised network share on your network. And I then think about the different exploit methods that might be delivered. So, for example, if the delivery method is phishing, I might be interested in Office macros that are used as part of those phishing campaigns. I then set out to answer the 3 questions which I need to answer. So what data do I need? How do I get it? And then how do I hunt through that data? So with external vectors, you're more likely to rely on logs which cover your perimeter, like bro logs if you're interested in the final downloads that are coming into your network, and email logs for things like your phishing campaigns. And with internal vectors, it's actually a bit trickier because you'll often be tracing things back to something which is already inside your network, where security measures are usually not as hardened. And this is where it becomes critical to have good visibility of the data sources that are inside your network, which are outlined here. And that covers your host, network, and log data sources. But like everything else in threat hunting, it's about knowing where the attacker can leave a trace by understanding how the attack that they're using actually works in the first place, and then go from there. So let's take the example of a phishing campaign, and this is something we find ourselves investigating quite a bit because it's one of the first steps of an attack which aims to gain a foothold on the network. And in this case, the attacker is going to use an Office macro which contains a PowerShell encoded stager for PowerShell Empire. And because the weak link here is the actual user who's going to be tricked into enabling the macros, that's going to bypass a lot of the controls which are already in place, and which is why red teams and criminals like to use the whole email attack surface so much. But we could do a whole talk about threat hunting on that specific attack surface, which is actually growing in popularity right now. So now if we start out with our hypothesis again for this stage of the attack, and if we say that we think that users have been compromised by an ongoing phishing campaign, which uses macro word documents, and then finding evidence of this by answering the 3 questions. So in terms of the data that you need, you're looking at process execution data to see PowerShell executing in the first place, along with the command line arguments that it's using. In this case, you'll be able to see the encoded microcode in the command line arguments. Enhanced PowerShell logging is also very good to have more visibility of PowerShell users and what it's actually used for, and then email logs to see who's receiving the emails and gain information on the domains and IPs that the attackers are deploying from, and that sort of thing. So the tools you need to collect that data will be something like Sysmon or OS Query. WinEvent logs will have all the PowerShell logging data that you're collecting, and then your email logs can be gathered from your email server or whichever third-party solution that you have. And so then this is the process pattern that you're looking for in terms of supporting your hypothesis in case of phishing. So you're looking for instances where either Word or Outlook is opening a document, then conhost is being called up, and then PowerShell is executing with a really long base64 encoded command, which can easily be decoded to confirm that it's malicious. And if attackers decide to be more advanced and obfuscate their PowerShell usage, which is facilitated because every function in PowerShell has several ways of being implemented and executed. So then your focus is on the PowerShell data that you're logging and to collect evidence of indicators of obfuscation. So you're moving away from process data, not leaving it behind, but using it to complement another data set, which is going to be PowerShell data in this case. And so that's what context building is about as you move along an attack chain. You're not just relying on one data set, you're trying to, as you go along, couple several data sets together to confirm your finding about a certain attack. So you can then query Kibana for that data and actually create visualizations to look for data which is specific to that pattern for that attack. And you can see how you then need to use your offensive knowledge to be able to take into account what the attackers have at their disposal, what techniques they might use, and then preemptively collect the right data sets and add them to your defensive use cases. So the next part we're interested in is persistence, and this is something you want to identify as a priority when dealing with an incident, because attackers need to be able to persist so that they can maintain access. And as long as you haven't figured out how they're doing that, you're not actually any closer to stopping them. So there's a lot of ways for an attacker to persist, and you can find an extensive list on the MITRE framework. On one hand, you have your traditional methods like run keys, services, and scheduled tasks. But attackers are becoming very creative in how they establish persistence with things like Office templates and hijacking genuine Windows features. And so this is where your host analysis skills really come into play, because you want to have an in-depth understanding of where the attacker might try to hide And nowadays that involves investigating things which might look like legitimate activity using the genuine tools, which is why the context that we're building at each step of the kill chain is so important, because if you're seeing activity that might be suspicious, but then you can attribute it to a sysadmin on the network, then that's fine. But at the same time, if that's not the case, then suddenly your suspicions rise way above the threshold, and you're actually seeing activity which an attacker is using, but that looks legitimate in the first place. So run keys are a good example to start with, and this is one of the least OPSEC safe methods for an attacker to actually use. But malware still makes use of the traditional methods of persistence quite a bit. So our hypothesis is going to be that the attacker is persisting using run keys, and to find evidence of that, we're going to query all the different registry locations for their run key values. And one way of doing that without necessarily relying on an EDR tool is to use something like a PowerShell script and then deploy it using your group policy to then query the registry and then ingest that data into Elastic so that you can visualize it properly. And here you have some examples of how you might then hunt through that data. So you can group your run keys by things like the executable that is being used along with their respective hashes to see if they're already known, for example, or by the path that they're actually launching from, along with the command line arguments, which are very useful to get context around what the executable is being used for. And quite a few times, having visibility of those gave me clues about the functionality of the executable that I have suspicions about, because you'd see certain flags being passed when it's executing for things like a directory or a password. And that sort of information is really useful once you get to the malware analysis stage and trying to figure out what function is which within the code, or just trying to figure out the flow of execution for the malware. So here's an example of what grouping that data set might actually look like. So on top, you're grouping the run keys by the path that it uses to see, and you see that it's doing so from the same path over 60,000 hosts. So Java is launching from that path, and you know that if it's from that path, then it's likely to be legitimate. On the other hand, if you only have one run key launching Java from a weird-looking path, and the arguments for it look pretty suspicious as well, and so from there you would be prompted to retrieve that file and get on with some malware analysis to figure out what that executable, what that binary is actually doing. So the third area that we have is lateral movement, and that has two key areas for you to look into if you're looking for evidence of it. So first we have recon, because the attacker needs to figure out where they are in the network and where they can move to next. And all the techniques here leave artifacts which can be collected for analysis and monitored for. And once the attacker has figured out where they are in the network, they'll usually use that information to get access to their next target. And one thing to keep in mind here is that you could actually go back to looking at infection vectors again, because that's still an option for an attacker to compromise more hosts on the network. Otherwise, you're going to focus on remote access tools, which rely on using credentials that have been compromised. So looking at things like PSExec and RDP with remote logins and PowerShell logging if PS remoting gets enabled. And again, logging in around the network like this will create artifacts for you to find and monitor. So to take our hypothesis again and say that the attacker is using credentials that they compromised after phishing the user to log into as many machines as they can on the network. So the data that's going to help you there is the Windows event logs, which have a lot of authentication IDs, which you can monitor for, and as well as bro logs to be able to monitor the internal activity of the network. And in order to collect that data to Elastic, you'll need something like WinBeat from the ALK stack to parse your Windows event logs into the JSON format that Elastic requires, and bro logs can be adjusted as they are. Now, when hunting through that data, you can start looking at several things. So the first one is anomalous user or service logins. And what I mean by that is that those users and services are authenticating to machines which they don't actually authenticate to, or they don't usually authenticate to. And especially with services, because those are supposed to be configured by a sysadmin. And so if they suddenly start to act differently, then that should raise your suspicions. Another pattern which is interesting is a high number of connections coming from one machine, and that can be caused by something like port scanning, or a user logging into loads of different machines at once. And this is going to be especially true when using tools like Bloodhound or Angry Puppy, which is the automated add-on that MDSec made for Bloodhound recently. And those methods can really stand out in some cases because of the large amount of Active Directory data that it queries in a very short amount of time. So for something like this, you can look for unusually high traffic on LDAP ports internally. And because you're grouping all that data in Elastic, you can visualize it pretty well and then catch those spikes in traffic. Another detail to keep an eye on is the session types that you see and the privileges attached to those sessions. So for example, if you have a user which is used to log in as a service session with network privileges on a certain machine, but suddenly you see that it's an interactive session with system, that should ring alarm bells and make you investigate things further. And the thing to note here is that with something like automating Bloodhound, you can see how attackers are adapting to this kind of monitoring by going for speed and the element of surprise once they get the initial foothold. Because if things get this far, it's likely to be too late for blue teams to do anything, which is why attackers here focus on speed. And threat hunters focus on the initial indicators of compromise that we discussed in the previous steps. And you could actually run Bloodhound on your own network to see how many hops an attacker is away from domain admin, and then use that information to reduce your attack service in this area to at least slow down their progress and give any defensive team the opportunity to have more time to catch attackers. And again, going back to the offensive and defensive kill chain that we mentioned, the goal is to execute the defensive kill chain faster than the attacker's one. So time is actually one of the key factors here. So that was just some of the key stages of the kill chain with some basic examples of how to hunt for each one. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because offensively speaking, this is the equivalent of going through a few Metasploit modules to explain how some attacks work. But the key here is that the methodology that we went through in terms of starting with your hypothesis and then answering the key questions to prove that hypothesis or disprove it can be applied over and over again to any stage of the kill chain that you're interested in. And as you progress, the goal is to tackle the really obscure techniques which attackers use and then close those gaps, preferably at scale and not just on a one-to-one basis, because that's not really feasible. And for example, one of the areas which wasn't addressed for a long time was automating memory analysis at scale to tackle fileless malware, which runs entirely in memory using things like code injection and API hooking. You also have machine learning, which allows you to take in those huge data sets, like the lateral movement data sets that we talked about, and still find the outliers which otherwise rely on manual hunting techniques to look for. And you can read more about those in the white papers that were published around those topics. So you can see how threat hunting has this pattern which involves automating manual methods to allow you to scale and then focus on things which you actually haven't seen before. So to wrap things up, the threat hunter role is becoming well established in the industry. And as we've seen today, you can do threat hunting in some capacity by adapting the skills that you already have to threat hunting. So it's not really reserved just to the elite people. Even if you're starting out as a junior or an inexperienced security team, you can start with the basics and work your way up. And anything which moves away from fully relying on automated security is progress. And in terms of improving yourself as a threat hunter, you should focus on improving both your offensive and defensive knowledge. And one of the best ways to achieve that is not only to be up to date with current events, but also set aside research time to both practice and test the skills and new techniques that you come across. And one thing I would recommend, especially for organizations which aspire to get a threat hunting program in place within the organization or to progress as a threat hunting team, is to use what we've talked about today to conduct what's called hunting sprints. And this is a great exercise where the security people you already have get together on a regular basis to hunt for signs of compromise on the estate or for a particular threat that they're concerned about. And using this methodology we talked about today, you then use the tools and capability which you already have in place without necessarily having to have a budget to then go and get like EDR tools or a managed threat hunting service. Which is why one of our favorite things to say at CommSec is that blue is the new red. It's why I enjoy being a threat hunter so much. And you're not limited in only doing one thing or just working on defense or offense. You're actually encouraged to do both of those things within your role. So the slides we made available for all the references that we used and the suggested resources to get started in the skill areas that were mentioned. I think I'm 2 minutes over time. If there's questions, I don't know if you have time, otherwise I'll be available right after the talk if you want to come and chat to me. Do we have time for questions? No? All right, we'll end it here and then I'll just speak to you guys right after then. Thank you very much.